The Sustainable Voice, bringing you big successes from small places worldwide.
Welcome back to Sustainable Voice. Hey guys, how's it going?
Hello, happy to be back.
Yes. Hello, hello, hello.
Lee, good to see you again. And guys, look, we have Jennifer back with us. We didn't scare her off. She's back for round two. That's pretty cool. We have been talking about Costa Rica specifically. We started this on the last episode, and we were talking about the challenges that Costa Rica has. A lot of them self-inflicted. Some of them not, but a lot of them self-inflicted, and some of the decisions that are questionable. And we talked about the roadblocks that they're putting in their own way. Jennifer, your background, your education, and why I think you're going to be the right person to ask these questions is because there are solutions to this. And there are some really good solutions to this from a tourism standpoint. And it's important because when we talk about these different countries, the amount of sovereign debt they have or don't have, right? The amount of national debt they have or don't have. And that's important, right? Costa Rica doesn't have as much in the way of debt owed to the IMF, but they have a large number in national debt. And that number is not getting smaller. There are economic issues facing every country, and Costa Rica is one of them. We talked about last time that the tourism industry is becoming commoditized. Over-tourism is taking place, and that's one that's an issue in several places. But in Costa Rica, it's having an effect that's very unique, and that's suppressing prices. It's actually suppressing income. It's suppressing jobs. It's creating unanticipated or unintended consequences. And we talked about the reasons that they happen. There was a myriad of them. This particular episode, let's talk about solutions. We've knocked you all down and depressed you. Now we're gonna pick you up and make you feel
Optimism.
better. Yeah. Optimism, absolutely. So, Jennifer, some initial thoughts. You obviously you work on the retail side of travel. You deal with clients in terms of planning some amazing trips. We talked about how sustainability is important, and you work that in without even saying it sometimes. In terms of it, just because it becomes political. What are some thoughts you have when you look outside looking in on a place like Costa Rica?
Well, lots of different thoughts. I like to look at what other countries are doing and like where things are working, because you can come up with new ideas all day, which is a great idea or it's a great thing to do. But if it doesn't have a track record proven of working, you're probably not going to convince people who don't want to do it. So looking at countries like Sweden and like the Nordic countries or Bhutan, or there's some island countries that are doing some really cool things, looking at what policies they're implementing and what the private sector in those countries are doing and how it's working and where it's working is where I like to start when kind of looking at recommendations for something like this.
Yeah. So, we talked about last time with tourism, over-tourism. You were talking about some of the things you do with clients going to Europe where over-tourism is an issue. What are some thoughts on curing over-tourism with Costa Rica? Some initial ideas that you may have.
I think marketing campaigns are going to be the strongest tool to help solve that. Because travel nowadays is kind of based in, oh, I see this on Instagram, I see this on TikTok, I want to do those things. That's a lot, especially for younger travelers. That's where they're getting their ideas. Mm-hmm. So if Costa Rica comes out with marketing plans, I think countries like Finland are doing this really well, where you highlight these destinations that aren't experiencing over-tourism, and then people who might go to the areas that are being smashed with over-tourism, they maybe see something else and like, oh, hey, I kind of want to go there. Or you highlight the time of the year that is the shoulder season or the off season, and kind of get people to travel and say, hey, it is good in the winter. We are like doing really cool things in the heat of the summer. Like there are still a lot of opportunities in the off season that you might not have thought of before.
I love that. I was just going to say that I was expecting, in my mind, I'm sitting here thinking, how do you, when you say over tourism, it means discourage people from going. But no, that's not what you're saying at all. You're just saying, let's spread it out, not only geographically, but time of year.
Because these countries depend on tourism for the money for the people who are in the tourism industry. They use their jobs to feed their families. So you don't want to discourage people from going. You just want to make it where the high season they're not getting killed, and in the low season they're not making any money. So if you spread it all out, then they're still making the amount of money that they want and need, but it's not in a way that's not sustainable.
You're talking about flattening the income curve, and that's actually fantastic. You were talking about that last time in Europe in terms of people going in the off season, so flattening the income curve for a lot of the indigenous people. This is important. In fact, the World Travel Tourism Council is doing this huge report on indigenous tourism, specifically the involvement with indigenous tourism. And we talked about this last time with Costa Rica. There's 8 different communities. And Lee, you talked about it when you went backpacking all those years ago, and how what drew me into your conversation, your eyes lit up when you were talking about the people you met.
Yeah.
And they weren't people from San Jose. They were people in villages, people that are local, people that the conversation wasn't contrived. It wasn't manufactured. It was real, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's the thing. And you've talked about in other places as well.
Mm-hmm.
When you were out on your expedition ships, when you got to a place where you had those kinds of conversations, how'd you feel after you got back on the boat?
Oh, great. I mean, just fantastic. It's always a win when people welcome you and want you in their community and want to share, their story. And it's the same. I went to Alaska last summer and went to a town most people don't go to, Petersburg, another, not over, I mean, they may have more tourism than they want, but the highlight was walking through a neighborhood and watching some middle school kids launching weather balloons. I mean, that was it. That was what was great, so anytime you can have an opportunity to connect with locals and see what their lifestyle is like. I mean, isn't that what we should all be traveling for, to understand?
I hear that from clients a lot, because they'll go somewhere and they have an idea of what is going to happen in this small town in Italy, but when they go there and they see the actual, like, authentic people just living their lives, it surprises them in the best way. And this
is such an important piece, because that's the part you said. I think you both said it, right? When somebody comes there welcoming you, there's 2 ways people welcome you, right? You go to a place, it's so good to see you, and then it's cha-ching, good to see you. We want to make sure that we get to places where people really feel authentic and welcome. So again, we talked about there's 8 different communities at least in Costa Rica, indigenous communities. In our best efforts, we'll get to 3 or 4. Right? They're not engaged in tourism the right way, and frankly, they have no motivation or incentive to be there. Right? If I have a table that's focused on tourism and I tell the indigenous people, well, you're not welcome here, but we're going to bring people to your place, what incentive do you have to be there? So Jennifer, you said the right thing, that basically if you're traveling in the off season, you're helping to flatten the income curve. You're helping to flatten. That's a great solution. There are rainy seasons, obviously, there. When you've had clients talk about that low season where the weather may not be as optimal, what kind of conversations do you have, and how does that conversation go?
I try to highlight that, I mean, people live there all year round, and they are existing in the rainy season and still living their lives and having beautiful days. So I just try to highlight that it may not be perfect weather-wise, but you might travel in the high season and it might not be perfect weather-wise. So you just have to kind of measure and kind of, I don't know, weigh your expectations a little bit, where you might have to stay inside and do some different activities, but it is still an opportunity for you to experience the region and experience it in a much more authentic way, because there's not buckets of other tourists there who are kind of like directing the path and everything. So it can be better even.
This is so important because stuff like climate change, shifts in temperatures. Like I just came from parts of California. It was 117 degrees in Palm Desert. And I know it always
we just
gets
had the 2 hottest days in a row.
Yeah. I mean,
look,
climate change is a political topic. I'm of the school to, if somebody who doesn't agree, say, look, tell me again how things aren't changing. Tell me again how this is all normal for it to be there. But, it becomes political, and we've talked about that on past episodes. But it's not. But at least an opportunity here to say, and you said it best. And look, the way we used to break up, it's going to rain in these months, not rain in these months. That's just simply not true anymore.
It's changing faster and faster. So
that's right. So getting, and going in low season or in off season, you're getting to people who are now clouded by, as you say, just buckets of tourists. What you're getting from them is probably what they were like when they first started working in the industry. right? They're not expecting to have work these months, and now you're giving them work, and they're grateful, right? Because most people who work in tourism, they have their months, and then the lean months, they're like, okay, I got to do something else, either farming, whatnot, or they hold their
seasonal work,
right, or they hold their breath for the seasonal work, and then it
cross
goes
their
in,
fingers, yeah,
right, and then it goes from there. So that's a great first. That's a great first, first step. A second step, and we talked about this last time, is the economic side. And this is the stuff that I brought up last time, that there's some questionable decisions that Costa Rica has made as an economy. And I think Lee and I have had conversations about the IMF. We've had conversations about the World Bank, and she's heard me just go off. So if I, if one day we hear what this start this episode and I'm not here, it means the wrong people heard what I had to say, and clearly I'm not around. Something happened. Yeah, send help. So, but I think there's something very important with this, is that, just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal talked about this, and other outlets have talked about this, the level of exports out of Latin America coming to other parts of the world. Tourism is an export for these countries. And in a lot of cases, it's 1, 2, or 3, right? It could be in the top 5, some cases, but it's definitely up there. It talked about countries like Ecuador and Peru and Costa Rica that have a dollar-denominated society, right? So the U.S., although they have the local currency, the U.S. dollar is their main trading platform. That's what they use, how they denominate their economy. If you look at the economy of Costa Rica, it is dollar derived. Yes, there's stuff in local currency, but everything tourism derived, and most things economically are based in US dollars. So the comparison it drew was that countries that still use their own currency, like the Colombian peso, their exports went up higher because things are cheaper, right? Why they're getting lower, why the currency was lower, that's a separate conversation. But the exports rose versus countries where the dollar was the main currency, because there wasn't as much of a shift in pricing, right? Now, there's something to be said about the fact that we never want to sit there and manipulate a country and just have exports coming from there, and be able to raise these exports and say I'm going to buy more from here because things are cheaper. Because what you're doing is setting an artificial price ceiling for these countries, where when the currency moves in the other direction, you're hurting them economically. So that's where dollar-derived economies have a benefit, right? They may not grow as much when their currency is weaker, but it means they're going to stay stable longer when things go the other way. The problem with Costa Rica, which we talked about last time, was the fact that they devalued the dollar in their economy to try to stave off inflation. Call a spade, right? If it's happening, it's happening. But tourism is a way to get money to cycle out of your economy, to get it to cycle globally. So economically, tourism represents that sector where, and when we talked about this, and what you're saying right now, that people travel in different times of the year, and they're bringing more money into the economy. That's more money that can then go in and cycle through the economy and cycle out, cycle through the economy and cycle out. But when you devalue your base currency to try to hide off the fact that your currency is collapsing, if you're going to actually value the whole currency in dollar, value it in dollars, right? And that's what countries like Argentina is heading towards. So there's an opportunity here in the sense that maybe they don't need to devalue their currency the right way. Is it going to help in the short term? Sure. But the long-term effects of it are going to be there. So from an economic standpoint, it actually blends into what you're saying in terms of traveling in different seasons. What other thoughts did you have in terms of solutions for Costa Rica?
Well, you're talking kind of about finance, which I'm not at all an expert in. I love learning from you about it. But I think there are so many countries, I think the number's a little over 50 right now, who do tourism taxes, that it's either a per person per day or a flat rate of something where if you are from outside this country and you come here, you have to give us money. Almost all of the countries take that money and they use it for different, obviously they all use it for different things, but there's a couple like Bhutan and some areas of Spain who use it as a sustainable development tax.
Yep.
Bhutan, I think they start off with about $200 per person per day equivalent. Yep. It's since been lowered to 100, but they use that to fund specifically things that are going to fight climate change and keep their tourism sustainable. Bhutan is one of my favorites. They focus on high value, low volume tourism, and they've been doing this like since the 80s. Basically, they limit the number of people who are coming in, which might work for some countries, might not work for others, but they focus on giving each person who visits a really rich experience so that they come back again and again, which they do. It's one of the most revisited countries whenever people do go there, but it's not overwhelming any of the areas. And another thing, just kind of my brain's going, but they also really, really bring the locals and the indigenous peoples to the table for all of their decisions. And they put such weight on what those people think because it's their home that these other people are visiting. So that is another thing that Costa Rica, we kind of touched on that earlier, but if they're going to move forward in any sort of sustainable way, they have to include the people who live there and who are from there.
You said something last episode about the tax Italy put on, and it didn't make a dent because it wasn't high enough, right? It
no,
and it wasn't that. Yeah, and it was a levy, not a sustainable tax. This is interesting because I agree with this very strongly, right? So India has taken a $1.5 billion loan from the World Bank specifically for sustainable development within the country. This is a country that 20 years ago couldn't have cared less about this, right? They're using kerosene and rickshaws and whatnot. So there's a development happening there. The sustainable development taxes, and Bhutan does this really well. I had the pleasure many, many years ago of actually meeting the son-in-law of the king of Bhutan. And I got a conversation to talk to him specifically about this. He's the one who brought the six senses to Bhutan, single hotel chain. And so I had a conversation to talk to him about this in detail. And, this is before he was set up, and he was talking about the fact that, he said, look, we measure our success in gross national happiness. But the reason we talk about this is because of the fact that we focus on low volume, high tourism. Now, there's a dynamic here in the sense that Costa Rica can't shift from high volume to low volume overnight, right? And they've been doing it so well. You can't take something and triple the price and say, okay, we're going to go low volume now because now it's going to have a shock of the system. But there is a gradual process towards this, right? It's happened. South Africa did this successfully. Kenya did this successfully. Egypt is doing it successfully right now, where they are starting to charge more and more. They have a bad habit of discounting when things go bad. But even right now, with everything happening in Gaza, Egypt's prices are still going up, right? They're charging more for what they do, which good, right? We complain about prices and how things have gotten expensive, but we cannot forget that travel is still a privilege. Right, it's how we remember to go to countries with respect. It's versus going there and imposing our will, on these
and the lower cost. Yeah, right. If you offer these discounts, you're bringing people in, and you're not giving the people who live there a livable wage. You're not giving the environment. Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Exactly.
And to what you're saying, if you have a high charge, low volume, then all the things, and Costa Rica is one of the cases where it's happening all over Europe and other places, where as people are coming in droves, they're driving the price of everything up, including residents, including food, including now locals can't afford to live here anymore. Right.
We talked about that in Italy last time, I think, where my friends in Italy they can't visit the places that they've been visiting their entire childhood because there's either way too many people or they're being priced out of it.
That's right.
Spain,
that's not fair at all.
Spain, they're in the middle of that right now, and Barcelona, and
right.
Oh yeah.
And
they're fighting back.
100%. And I think this is something that's so important because, and then they're fighting back. And Lee and I talked about this, right? They're fighting back. And on the one hand, you're like, wait a second, you guys were part of the European debt crisis. If you were in Greece, Italy, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, you were in this, you were at the epicenter of this debt crisis. Tourism is one of the main reasons that you got out of that crisis. That you're able to pay your bills now. And austerity measures were pretty dire at that point. But the pendulum has swung the other way. There has to be a middle balance. And I really like the idea of a sustainable levy, a sustainable tourism or sustainable development levy.
Where all of that money goes into a fund. It doesn't get siphoned off by other.
So I have a question for you. I have a question for you, and this applies here because we talked about this. Lee and I talked about the IMF. Who oversees that? How do you prevent corruption from happening with that levy to make sure the money's not used in a different way?
I love that question. I definitely don't have it. How do you prevent? I don't. Right. I would love for that to have an easy answer. I mean, checks and balances, but there's nothing you can do to keep government officials from digging in pockets.
Well, that's where. So here's what I'll say to you: the conversation hasn't even gotten there. right? And that's the thing. Like we talked about with the IMF, the way they're lending to countries and what they're doing and how they're choking out countries economically. And I'll say it again because they are. You know, and if anybody from the IMF is listening, tough. This is
They're coming for you.
Yeah, come on the show and debate me. I'll give you 10 minutes. Come on the show and change my mind. So one of the things that I would talk about, the fact that there is no oversight. I'm not saying it. There's a professor from the University of Pretoria who wrote this on LinkedIn and said this in detail, that there needs to be an international oversight. So if you have an international organization like the IMF that's designed to help fragile economies, there should be an international economy or international board, right? Made up of in the best countries that have the best practices in tourism, and Costa Rica should be there. And we talk about some the countries that we hold in the pedestal, right? It's an evolving board that changes on 2-year terms. Every 2 years, the board changes and it goes to best practice countries. So you basically get voted on this board because your country is among the top in what they're doing, right? So whether it's conservancies in Kenya, whether it's the way you become completely plastic free, or the way you're handling tourism in Ecuador, or whatever the case, right? There's different parts of the world. Bhutan, for example, would be on this list. And could you imagine a member of the royal family of Bhutan are an international board of oversight for a sustainable development levy, where everybody is paying into the levy. And here's the best part. And I was thinking about this, and that's why I asked the question, because I was like, I want to hit the conversation here, because I was thinking about this a lot. I had a long time on the plane to think about this, and it was actually part of the conversation I had yesterday with a nice gentleman who poured scalding coffee on my leg. But it was it was a really nice conversation. You know, I felt the burn. So it was a good conversation. But I think if you can think about this, right? I'll take a sports analogy, and this is how I drew it up. Baseball has, and I know baseball is not what we want to talk about here, but there's something on the revenue sharing that actually makes sense. They have a centralized pot that everybody pays into on an equal level, and it's related to your revenue share based on how much money you get in. Based on how much money you get in, you put into a central pot, and that revenue is then shared with every team. So what that means is if you're the Yankees, you're going to have a larger payroll than the Florida Marlins. But everybody's paying into the pot, which means that there's revenue sharing. So no team is actually, if you're not being penalized for being in a small market, right? So Costa Rica is not going to have the budget of Spain. Bhutan's not going to have the budget of an Ecuador. But if you had a centralized body, a centralized account, a global one, that everybody paid their sustainable tourism levy into one account, it all went in relative to your GDP, and maybe it's tied in to relative to your tourism revenue. It's a specific factor of your tourism revenue. Maybe it's made up of tourism revenue, less national debt, whatever the case. Who knows, right? But there's a formula that people smarter than us can figure out. But then once it comes from there, it's paid to a central boat, into a central account. Now, this is where the IMF gets it wrong, where we can get this right. You have an oversight board that goes every 2 years, it changes, right? And every 2 years, you have an audit of every country that's paying in, right? So you could choose not to be part of this, but then you're not going to be on this drive. Right now, we talk about sustainable tourism, sustainable development within countries, and it's unevenly applied, right? Because certain countries go, don't care about this. Whereas a country like Namibia, which has sustainability written in as an amendment to their constitution, they could be on this board saying, yeah, okay, this is how it's
having a lot more power.
You could have universal application of indigenous communities. You could have universal application of universal tourism, of indigenous tourism, of sustainable levies, of everything else. You have a set formula like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? You have a set formula that's done. And this already exists, right? I had a long conversation between our last recording and now, working with the Colombian Tourism Board, breaking apart their financials to figure out the actual contribution tourism has in their economy for a presentation I have to make. And I was going through looking at every aspect of it. And the way they calculated out their contributions, from transport to hotels to food, everything else, was following the UNWTO guidelines. Why can't the UNWTO be asked to create guidelines of sustainable tourism levies? Right? Development levies, and have a universal formula that everybody has to follow. It is an X percent, it's a factor. It's X percent of either your GDP or X factor of tourism revenue as a percentage of GDP, less your national debt, multiplied by a constant. Right?
A lot of math there, but I'm here for it.
Same.
I'm trying to think about that on the plane. I love that idea. I worry, as I always do with anything with kind of people in power, keeping the corruption out would be a difficult. I don't know how you do that. Maybe look to where it's working. I have friends or you go.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I have friends in Sweden who we, are just talking about differences between the US and Sweden. And my friend's paycheck gets taxed at over 70% of his paycheck goes to the government. And I mean, could you imagine if that happened in the US, what people would say? But I was like, doesn't that make you mad that you're working and almost all of your money is not being kept? And he said, no, because I'm getting so much benefit out of it. I see it in my roads. I see it in our schools. I see it in all the recreation opportunities that I have. And so maybe looking to these countries who are doing it well, where the people are not angry that their money is being taken, and seeing how they're doing it and modeling this new, because if you're starting from scratch, you got a lot of opportunity to tailor.
That's exactly where you've said it. You said the magic word. It's funny enough you mentioned Sweden. I actually did my senior thesis in college on global healthcare reform. And I tied a non-coalition government's successful healthcare in Sweden was the best example of global healthcare.
I bet it was.
So to what you're saying, and this is what protests in Kenya is protesting about right now is that our paychecks are being debited 50%. It's already a small paycheck, debited 50%. What are we getting in return? Corruption's a problem, right?
Exactly.
You're paying more in interest payments and everything else. What we have here in the U.S., our interest payments and our debt is over. It's 75% of our budget is going towards payments, debt. So to your point, you have best example countries like a Sweden, like a Bhutan, right? These and what happens is this: is if you look to the best, you will always get the best. So that means a country that maybe is not the best example of this, like Australia is a great example of this. Let's say, for example, that if there are members who are not applying it properly, where corruption comes in, they're held accountable. There's covenants in those bylaws that talk about removal of countries from this board, which is what the IMF is missing right now, right? That says that you have corruption, you are eliminated from getting any kind of aid from the IMF or any kind of aid because they don't have that, right? They say they do, but they don't. And I'm going to digress for 1 second because it applies here, right?
Please.
They'll turn to Kenya and say, you're in default. Your credit line is cut off. You're not getting any more money. Then they'll go to Argentina and say, okay, go ahead and default. Don't worry, it's okay. Just go ahead and default. 9 times default. Okay, we'll get more money for you. They go to Kenya and say, pay us back. They go to Argentina and say, okay, restructure your debt. Don't worry, restructure. It's okay. It's the same thing here. You can have the best countries. The ones we hold, you said it best in the first episode, the ones we hold on a pedestal. Because they're the ones who are going to be there. And every year you have a chairman of this, right? It's just like you have any committee. But the chairman is coming in from the best countries. There are guidelines and there are standards. Is it going to be perfect? Of course not. But if there's a way to do this, where you have bylaws, you have everything else in, and there is a set formula for everybody to pay into a sustainable development level. Now, some people will come and say, well, that's socialism. And I will say to you, you don't know the meaning of the word because you haven't lived overseas. And again, anybody who thinks that being socialist, come on the show and debate me 10 minutes. So that's the whole point, right? It's not that you're talking about a government, but not a government body, an international body. And it is made up. And the other part I thought about this was this. What's missing from the IMF is private sector. It's countries. What's missing is private sector. This board is not just made up of tourism ministers or countries. This board has to be made up of the best examples of private sector, right? Companies, individual companies that are doing that represent the best examples of sustainable tourism reapplied. Right, companies like Beyond, for example, right, that have shown that they are reinvesting all their resources in the right way. And I'm just using them as an example. Companies like Lindblad Expeditions that are showing that they're reinvesting the right way. Right, that's the whole point. Private sector. Now, I sit on a Sustainable Tourism Council with some of these leaders, so I know how they talk. And I've heard them talk. I've heard the CEO of Ambion talk. I've sat down with him. He's actually the person who's taught me. I've sat with Sven Lindblad. I've listened to him. I'll never forget, I sat on a panel with Sven Lindblad in 2007. I'm sorry. It was in New York, and we were talking about Antarctica. And he said something that quieted the room immediately. And this was 2007. He said, When we started doing Antarctica, there were 15 ships and 15 crew that knew how to navigate Antarctica. And Lee, you'll appreciate this.
Mm-hmm.
This was 2007. He said today, and that's back then, there are over 50 ships doing Antarctica. There are not 50 crew who know how to navigate Antarctica. And he's right then, and he's even more right today.
Yeah.
Right. So that people like that.
People, who are in the industry and know what's going on.
And the World Travel Tourism Council could be the outside body that is actually putting people. So it could be aligned in different ways, but you have this in every country that wants to be part of it. So there are countries who can choose to say, look, we don't care about sustainable tourism. We don't care about this. Fantastic. You know what? Don't join the committee. Don't join. Stay out of it. Here's what's going to happen. The largest
You will later.
You will later. Exactly. Because the largest transfer of wealth is occurring in the next 2 to 3 years, or even the next 5 years, from Generation X over to the new generation, right? Over to millennials, Gen Ys, Gen Zs. Guess what they care about the most?
Having a planet we can live on.
That's it. I had this conversation with somebody that is going to be working with me in India, and we talked about this, and he is a Gen Z. And I said this to him. I said, your generation is the one who just went to the World Bank and said $1.5 billion for sustainable development. I've never seen more wind turbines in India than I ever have this time around. Right. And that was the key. That's a huge shift. And he was the way, and I said, it's your generation, not mine. It's yours. And that's what's happening. So if countries say, we don't care about this, cool, do you, no problem. But in 5 years, and I learned this from a friend at Lindblad. What she told me, she goes, give him your card and say, here's my card. You'll need this one day.
Save it for down the road.
That's it. That's exactly. So that's from the economic standpoint.
Yeah. And I think to your point about bringing in the private sector, just bringing in a wide variety of people who live in your country. Like,
that's right.
It doesn't have to be a lot, but just make sure that everybody's represented so that you can have new ideas that you wouldn't have thought of before. And I think that's something Finland does really well. One of their, written in their tourism goals is that we're trying to bring everybody to the table so that we can benefit everybody and make sure that we're moving forward in the best possible way. Because if you don't have these people who might come up with the ideas, you'll never get that idea, and then you won't be able to implement it. So
and enter the third sector of this council, because you've pretty much hit the nail on the head. Not just so it's the world leaders, private sector, indigenous leaders.
Yes,
that's the third one.
Say it again.
Indigenous leaders. That's the one. So preach. So look, I had a conversation, and this is years ago. I spent a lot of time with a gentleman named Phil Cram. Phil was the head of sustainability for one and only Wolgan Valley in Australia. And we were talking about a land conservation trust. I was showing him some of the things that were happening in parts of Africa in terms of land conservation trusts and what's being set up to land that's being given back to indigenous communities, and then camps, hotels, leasing or paying them a right, like a conservancy. So he was talking at the time, he's not there anymore. We were talking at the time about he wanted to set up a land conservation trust. What he was worried about is mining companies were coming into that part of the little mountains. The way they were mining, they were hitting the water table. And it was going to have an effect on the waters, on water within the communities. So he went to all the Aboriginal communities, indigenous communities within that part of Australia. I correct myself. I shouldn't say that. It's indigenous communities, not Aboriginal. So indigenous communities that actually went there and talked to them. And he said, okay, we want to set up a land conservation trust. For every acre we have, we'll give you 3 acres. And that was a land conservation trust. The communities couldn't figure out whose right land it was. So he said, tell you what, you go to the historical documents, you figure out whose land it is, and then come back to me and we'll go from there. So what that means is the same way you have a rotating 2-year board with private sector, rotating 2-year board with world leaders. You have a rotating 2-year board with indigenous communities. And it's not every community in the world. It is whatever country is on the board. So whatever country, and and again, this I'm open to debate on this part, obviously, but you have, let's say, a world leader that's going to be on the board. Then you have a private sector from other countries that are on the board, that represent best examples. Then you have indigenous leaders from other countries that are on the board. And what that does is what you talked about earlier. How do you keep government hands out of it? Corruption it will never be solved, but it'll be controlled through accountability. World leaders love to talk about accountability. Oh, we're going to be accountable and whatnot. You know what that means? Nothing.
Exactly. I was about to say.
Nothing.
Yep.
But if the private sector, which they're not charitable organizations. They are doing this for for profitability. They want their EBITDA to go up. They want their companies' yields to go up. They see sustainable tourism not just as a means of making the world better, but they see it as a means of being more successful and being able to scale their companies as well. Indigenous communities want a seat at the table, and they want to sit at the table where they're not an afterthought, where they're actually being talked to, not being seen as a charity case. In many cases, Costa Rica included, these indigenous communities, oh, yes, we'll bring tourism here. What do you need? Is that what you need? And it annoys me when that happens, because they're people. They have equal voices like everybody else. Just because they don't have 5 degrees.
I think they should have more weight to their voice, because this is their land. This is where they have been living for generations. You have to listen to them, or it. Yeah,
that's right.
Continue. Sorry.
There is a TED Talk that I will tell everybody about until the cow comes in. Now, Lee is convinced that one day I'm going to give a TED Talk, and it's one of my missions in life. It's one of my life goals to be on that stage. So I will tell you my 2 favorite TED Talks. One is Monica Lewinsky about cyberbullying, and it was frankly amazing. What she talked about if anybody's listening that can show this to her, or if she sees it, kudos. Absolutely amazing. The other one is a gentleman named Richard Turner. He was 13 years old when he gave this TED Talk. It was years ago.
What?
He was a villager from Nairobi National Park. He was a Maasai from Nairobi National Park. He took apart an LED or a flashlight, and over the course of a period of time, he took apart a flashlight and set it up on in his village. And he sorted out how to keep lions from hunting their livestock. A 13-year-old kid.
Jeez, with a flashlight?
With a flashlight.
Okay.
And this is important because lions hunt livestock. So Maasai are taught to hate lions, so they would hunt them. There was one of the leading causes of death for lions. It wasn't trophy hunting. It was the local Maasai protecting their livestock. This 13-year-old kid figured out what the best scholars in the world couldn't figure out for decades. He figured it out in 3 years, what to do. And he tried everything. And he was giving this TED Talk about this. I was hanging on his every word. And the first thing he said, he goes, I am a Maasai from Nairobi National Park. And I remember I saw it and I started chuckling. And my son comes to me, he goes, what are you laughing? I go, listen to this. And he heard it and I go, not so stupid after all. And so I said, look, and I go, these people, they have the best examples. I'll give you another example. Danilo was an elder tribesman from the Taibo tribes in Colombia. I took him to Virtuous Travel Week in 2009, and he was talking about how their community, he was one of the last surviving descendants, how their community learns from Mother Earth. They wear these bracelets up and down their arm called caña flechas, made from hearted palm. They take out the palm and they wave them into bracelets and they wear them up and down their arm. And he said, this is how I learned from Mother Earth. This is every time the Mother Earth teaches us something, we tie a new bracelet. And he had them all the way up. Right?
Wow. That's really neat.
So one of the cardinal lessons he learned was about caring for other people, right? I know it sounds pretty basic, right? So that was in 2009. Let me take you back to this past January. He drowned in the ocean. He never learned how to swim, but he drowned because he was saving somebody else's life. He saw somebody drowning in the ocean off the coast of where he is. He jumped into the water, not knowing how to swim, to save somebody else's life because he stayed true to those kind of flechas. Still think he's not smart? Those people need to be at the table.
Yes.
Right? Could you imagine if this community existed? If this council existed and the president of Ecuador is telling this council, I need $42 billion a year to save the Amazon jungle. I can't do it otherwise. I know you want me to do it, but I can't. I don't have the money to do it. And the other countries don't have the money to do it either. How would you like me to do this? Right? What $42 billion a year is what, just from my sector of the Amazon, $42 billion a year. Now imagine if that conversation is happening at a Sustainable Development Council with Bhutan at the table, Namibia at the table, let's say
people who have their priorities straight.
Right.
Yes.
And then you have indigenous communities at the table, and especially somebody from the Amazon saying, we'll help you because what's happening is oil companies are taking our land, or logging companies are taking our land. They're promising us riches and big TVs and everything else and whatnot. They give us everything, but they don't give us electricity. So we live in poverty. And then we're left to mine mercury or trafficking or everything else, whatever the case. Now imagine if that conversation, that dialogue was occurring and there was this a committee outside that was moderating this discussion. Could you imagine what kind of solutions could come out if that conversation, that's why you need this as an international organization. Everybody pays in.
How do we do this? How do we get this to happen? Because I think this is a fantastic idea.
All right. Remember the moment. Remember the moment. Lee, this is my TED Talk. Remember the moment.
Okay, this is your TED Talk. A global
Sustainable Development Committee.
Committee. But wait, so let's bring this back to Costa Rica. Does Costa Rica? Well, I have two questions, but because we're going to bring it home here in a minute. But does Costa Rica? I mean, surely, like they're the leader in tourism around the world. Surely they have their own internal tourism committee. I'm not talking to the tourism board. Do they not have any kind of alliance?
Well, if they are, they're not there, because if they were there, the indigenous communities that we're talking about would have already been in the conversation. They're not. They're not. Their areas are not. You take a look at Costa Rica and you can basically pinpoint 4 or 5 areas where the areas have been developed fully, right? Papagayo, Guanacaste, Arenal, San Jose, maybe Monteverde, right? I mean, Jennifer, did I miss any areas? Was that about right?
That sounds about right. That's where I send people.
Yeah. So, I mean, and give or take one place, but if you, to Jennifer's point, if there's a committee here and the local indigenous communities are part of the table and part of the conversation, and they see the benefit of tourism, wouldn't more areas like Turrialba be opening up? That's an active volcano in Turrialba. It's what Arenal used to be. And wouldn't that, and I'm not talking about zip lines and activities, I'm talking about real tourism. Wouldn't that open up? Wouldn't other parts of the coastline open up? Wouldn't other areas in the interior of Costa Rica open up? We're talking about a large.
You have to develop the infrastructure, which is another one of my points. Like if I can't get somewhere, if it's not easy for one of my clients to get somewhere, they only have a limited amount of time. They don't want to spend 8 hours on the road. Well, like not only for tourism, but also for the local people. If public transport is incorporated, it's just going to be better overall. As we've seen an example after example, it's better for citizens if they can get around on public transportation.
Take what Jennifer,
it's better for the climate.
Take what Jennifer just said. So this is, and take on a small scale of Costa Rica, and this can be scaled up to a large committee. So to what you're asking, Lee, and also Jennifer, you're saying as well. Now imagine that committee does exist effectively, right? Maybe they're there, but if they're there, they're doing a piss poor job of being effective. So maybe they're actually effective in what they're doing. Let's say they are. Now, if that's the case, what about coming to them and saying infrastructure is first? How are you going to get here? The roads are going to be pretty bad. This, that. Okay, local community, would you like these roads fixed? No, we don't want trucks going through here. Okay, fantastic. You know what? If you are able to carve out an airstrip for us, would we be able to fly out here? And if we fly out here, by the way, can we actually look at complying with international SAF standards to be able to use sustainable aviation fuel to fly around? And we go to Vancouver, Costa Rica can go to Vancouver and say, hey, you guys are using electricity to actually fly now between Vancouver and Victoria Island and whatnot, using Cessnas that are running on electric motors. Can you help us here? Can you do this? Can you do that? The conversation shifts, but infrastructure is the first thing that comes up. Whether it's just Costa Rica, whether it's that sustainable development committee we're talking about, but that's checklist. And infrastructure is the first thing. And a lot of people think infrastructure means let's go and just build out the 6th-line highway to get it work.
No,
that's not what people want. But it could be something as simple as saying, okay, not as simple as a relative word, but about coming and saying, you know what, much like I think there was a couple of countries in Europe, I think UK has announced that they're going to comply with international sustainable aviation fuel standards by 2027 or 2026, I think, something like that.
That sounds right.
Coming up pretty soon. If UK can do it, which they don't get a lot of things right all on the summer, but if they could do it. And look, I have family in UK, so I can openly say. By the way, if anybody from UK is listening, can we have our jewels back, please? Just had to ask again. So,
for sure.
Anyway, so so that's there. Take that to Costa Rica.
Yeah.
Surely there's a way the Costa Rican government, as you said, they are put on the pedestal. When you're put on the pedestal, that gives you the right and the access and the privilege to have conversations with the brightest minds in the world. Say, this is what we want. And that doesn't involve, world banking organizations coming and saying, well, we'll help you, but you're going to give you the money to do it, but you got to pay us back at this exorbitant interest rate. It could be a conversation with the UK. I'm sure you need to tell me the president of Costa Rica cannot call the prime minister of England and say, how did you do this? Can you help us? He can't call
it doesn't even, I mean, for sure, look at the places who are doing it best, but it's kind of hard when, correct me if I'm wrong, the economies are so much different in size. So looking at places like Barbados is really putting a lot of a lot of emphasis on their public
Right.
transport, and they're really
Absolutely.
transforming as such a small island nation. If they can do it,
Right.
Costa Rica can do it.
And small island nation that I have to add that every 5 years or so gets completely wiped out because of a hurricane and has to rebuild, and they still maintain it. So you're absolutely right. And if Costa Rica is charging a sustainable development levy, like you're talking about, there could be a plan saying by 2028, we want to have sustainable aviation fuel used in our flights here. We want to have access to these places. We're going to have airships built here and here and here and here. We're going to do this. We're going to bring the indigenous communities. There's a grand plan, an actual sustainable development plan put in place. It starts there. Infrastructure is the first thing that comes up. Access comes up. The indigenous community has to be part of that conversation as well, to say, oh yes, and we're doing this with Colombia right now, and the government of Colombia, or the tourist board of Colombia, is talking about this, where they're going to parts of Colombia that are not involved in tourism to try to show them the benefit, not force them, but to go and negotiate with them and show them, this is what we want to do. Does this align with your vision? This is what we want to help create, help protect, whatnot, and create a vision for the future.
Yeah.
Do they have it perfect? Of course not, but they're starting the conversation. That conversation isn't even happening in Costa Rica. At least start the conversation.
Yes.
So to lead to your question, that's where it starts.
Yeah.
Costa Rica has an opportunity. This idea of a sustainable development committee, which anybody else think, remember this day, remember this day. All right. I will take royalties. I'm just kidding. Costa Rica has the ability and has the opportunity as a country that's held on a pedestal to say, we are one of the countries that invented ecotourism. We are one of the drivers of sustainable tourism. As we enter the next phase of our global population, where the next generation is taking over as leaders, we are going to be at the forefront of the new conversation. And the new conversation is about indigenous tourism. The new conversation is about indigenous communities. The new conversation is about being climate friendly, about actually protecting the planet that we have. It's not about politics. Right. And the first thing people would say was, what we already have a high national debt. How are we going to pay for it? Sustainable tourism development levy. Mm-hmm. Just put it into one pot, but you have to have a vision for what that money is going to be used for and collect on everything.
Yep. And have accountability so that it actually goes to those things you want it to be used for. Yep.
And we bring it back to the very first point that we made in the last episode of Costa Rica. How do you start the conversation? Charge more money.
Well, that was going to be my final question, is how does a regular traveler, somebody like me who just wants to go to Costa Rica, go without feeling guilty? Because right now I feel really bad. Like you guys have made me feel like I'm a dirtbag if I want to go to Costa Rica.
No, that's definitely not it.
But, I know it's not, but you know what I mean? Like I'm being overly dramatic, but I do feel like now I have some responsibility to do things a little better. So how do I do that?
So, and Jennifer, I'll let you chime in. Yeah. And I'm not saying get ripped off, but pay a fair price. Stop looking for deals. Anytime I see discounts or deals in travel, I cringe. Not because we don't all want deals. Look, we all want to get a good deal on things. Just ask yourself where that money is coming from. If I'm buying a car, for example, and it's a discount, I don't feel as guilty because I know the manufacturer is giving a 7% kickback to the dealership as well. So there's still money to be made, right? There's the math behind it is there. If you're going and buying groceries and you're buying something that's imported from another country versus something that's grown locally from a farmer, I'll pay more for the one grown locally from a farmer because I know where it's coming from, right? The whole organic and whatnot. But you start taking a look at local, like here in Florida, we have a lot of local farms. We buy our stuff on local farms here, and you could see where the money is going. That's pretty special. So
vote with your dollar.
Right. Vote with your dollar. It's exactly right.
Yeah.
But
like
before people pay, that's actually a very good phrase. Before people pay more, you have to see where it's going. So in Costa Rica standpoint, charge a fair price for what you're doing and show transparency as to where that money is going. Where is it supporting? If we go to places like, for example, if you go to some of the most touristy places, they'll talk about, oh, well, we're giving back in this and this and this. That's like 0.1% of what they're doing. What about everything else?
Yep.
Right?
To that point, educate yourself, to answer your question, Lee. Like either educate yourself, but it is such a complex topic and there's so much greenwashing out there that it can be overwhelming. And if you're just trying to plan a simple vacation, you'll get burned out really quick if you're trying to do everything perfectly.
Right.
So not to plug myself, but maybe reach out to someone who is educated already and who is in this field and who knows all of the suppliers and the hotels and the people who are actually doing their best for the environment versus the ones who are using it as a marketing scheme to get people in, because that is rampant throughout the entire industry. So learn how to spot it and then choose the ones who are actually doing their best.
Absolutely right.
I like that.
Do what I would recommend. Yeah.
That's easy.
Exactly.
Well, sounds easy.
I know, but being able to lean on somebody who's done the research.
Yes, definitely.
Well, and you said lean somebody who does the research, and then the first step actually is easy. The first step is to actually, if you see a discount, the first question to ask anybody who sees a discount on anything you're doing, where's the money coming from? How am I getting this discount? If the person can answer you and the discount's worthwhile, great, fantastic. If the person can't if the person can't answer you, there's a problem. All right, there are countries in the world, I won't name them, where you ask them, I've had this conversation, where's the discount coming from? And then you ask one person, oh, well, we have seasonal promotions. Well, that's great. It's not what I asked. Where's the discount coming from?
I've never looked at a discount anywhere at any store anywhere and thought, I mean, yeah, I'll take advantage of them, but that means the business is having a problem.
Right. Exactly. Or they're trying
or they're
to
taking exactly. They're taking it from one pot that might need it, and they're putting it into this person who doesn't need it, who could pay the extra $500 for their stay or whatever.
Right.
This particular country was taking money out of guides' pockets. That's where the discount came from.
Mm-hmm.
Paying less for guides and lowering the requirement to be a guide.
Exactly.
We have a similar situation in the U.S. Teachers.
Yeah.
Everybody in the world knows teachers in the U.S. don't get paid enough. It's the same thing here. We have to educate ourselves. This is a separate topic, but this is an offshoot of a lack of education or quality of education because the brightest minds aren't being rewarded by having the most access. And that's what Costa Rica needs. They have some very bright minds there, but they're not being given a voice.
Yeah. Yep. Educate not only the tourists who are coming in, but also the people who live there on best practices and things like that.
That's right. That's exactly right.
One more thing that I wanted to just touch on that I would love to see Costa Rica do is in Flanders in Belgium, they are doing a lot of research into ocean cruising and how ports of call are being affected by these mega ships. And I could go on a rant about ocean cruising. I won't go. No, you don't want to hear it. I get real mad. I just think it's one of the worst things in the world. But basically, they're first doing the research on how are we being affected by these huge ships that are dumping all of their people all at once for one day. How is that affecting our local people and our economy and everything? And they're actually starting, I don't know if it's started now or if they're implementing it next year, but they are limiting, if it's a mega ship, you're not allowed to go to certain ports in the area. You have to have a certain threshold of maximum number of people, and then you're allowed to come in, which great. If Costa Rica implemented that, I think that would be I don't know if it would be easy, but I think it would be a very effective tool that could help with their sustainable development. Again,
the conversation has to start, right? The effect on the shoreline, the erosion, the effect on wildlife, on the seabeds, everything else. In Sri Lanka right now, for example, we're getting
Thank you for listening to The Sustainable Voice. If you have a success story of your own, please reach out and share it with us. We'd love to hear from you. See you next time.
Act as a filter for the water, for the local fishermen and whatnot. The sediment, everything gets caught behind, and what's left behind is the right type of environment for sustainable fishing along that coastline. So this is Sri Lanka. It's a country that 3 years ago was basically suffering from a complete coup, and now here we are. Costa Rica has this opportunity. They are a shining light. They are held up on the pedestal, and what you said at the very beginning, Jennifer. Are we holding them too high? Is this our base? Is this our benchmark? Is this what we're aiming towards? Shouldn't it be higher? Yes. But the country that can actually make it higher is Costa Rica, because they already have the tools in place. As I said in the beginning, and I said in the last episode, almost everything, pandemic aside, almost everything else that's happening in Costa Rica is self-inflicted. If you're going to actually cut your toe off, don't ask why it's hurting.
I
mean, so you have anybody in Costa Rica that's listening, you have the ability to impact this change. Start a conversation. And if your elected leaders don't understand this, vote them out.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's easier said than done, but you actually can represent. You are a tourism dependent economy. There's no time to embrace it. You can't run from it. Time to embrace it. You've embraced it, but embrace it the right way, not the wrong way.
Embrace it for the long term, not for these short-term gains that you're doing right now.
Exactly.
Yep.
That's pretty good note to end on.
Yeah. All right.
Well, to everybody that's listening, thank you so much. Thank you, both of you as well, for this conversation. Any closing words either of you want to share?
I think I said everything that I was wanting to say.
I think you said it well too, Lee.
Yeah.
Any words of wisdom?
No, but I'm going to go to Costa Rica again soon. But
yeah, you are.
Yeah, there you
somewhere.
Are. Oh, there it is.
Jennifer.
Yeah, you are. Exactly.
I'll be here.
Yeah.
To all of our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us. Stay tuned for the next episode. And remember, we talk about this all the time. Make that change in your life. Make that change to create small successes or big successes, in small places in your life. Make that change in your life. Start asking questions about how you can impact other people's lives, because that's what we're all here for.
Well said.
Thank you for listening to The Sustainable Voice. If you have a success story of your own, please reach out and share it with us. Would love to hear from you. See you next time.